Hey, Arlo and Frank. Grandpa coming to you from High Falls State Park in Georgia, which is kind of halfway or a little less than halfway from Macon to Atlanta. Tomorrow we're going to head to see you, Arlo, and your mom and dad up in Chattanooga. And then grandmother and I are going to drive down into Alabama, spend the night, and then spend a couple days with Aunt Courtney and Uncle Salem down in New Orleans. This is a beautiful place. Waterfalls, bunch of waterfalls. People are having campfires. It's not a lot of people here. It's mid-September. And there's the camper van in the background with your grandmom in there someplace, hiding from the bugs. So today I want to talk to you about a member of your family. I don't know what kind of grandfather he was. And by that I mean great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, or maybe, because I never figured it out. But one day when I was a little kid, my mom came to my dad and said, there's some mail from your cousin, this lady who, I don't think I ever met her. Maybe I did, maybe I didn't. But I was a little guy at the time. And so my dad opened it up and he said, oh, my cousin thinks that we're related to somebody who signed the Declaration of Independence, a guy named Joh Hart. And my mom was like, really? How could that be? I never heard anything about famous people in your family. And he said, well, I did have a grandmother, Hart, who lived in Germantown. And so it makes sense that maybe she was a direct descendant of this person. Now, what the cousin was trying to do was to get into something called the Descendants of the Signers of Declaration of Independence. And you can't just be related to the person, you actually have to be a descendant of them. And for a lot of them, there's no descendants left. There's a bunch for this guy, Joh Hart, from Hopewell Township, New Jersey, because he had 13 kids. So let me tell you some things about John. Well, first off, my mom was very skeptical. I don't know about this. But it turned out that my aunt was correct, and we got this thing back saying, oh yeah, to my dad, you and your kids are all eligible to be in this organization. And I just never got around to doing it. I was, as I said, I was little at the time, so it wasn't anything that I was going to act on then. But then I got interested in them later on because I worked in the area. But Joh Hart was born sometime between 1706 and 1713. And he was either born in Stonington, Connecticut, or Hopewell Township, New Jersey. I worked in Hopewell Township, New Jersey as a revenue officer in the 1990s, and so I got to visit his homestead, his former homestead. We'll talk about that later. At that place, there was a museum, and I bought a book about him and read the book. It hasn't made it to this last move, so I don't have it anymore. I couldn't do any more research on this except for Professor Google. His dad was a guy named Edward Hart, Captain Edward Hart, who was a farmer, a public assessor, justice of the peace, and the leader of the local militia during the French and Indian War. That was the war that was kind of pretty soon before the American Revolution, when we were still British citizens and we were fighting the French, and the French had some allied Indian tribes. Joh Hart's grandpa's name also was John Hart. And he was a carpenter who came from Hopewell, came to Hopewell from a place called Newtown, Long Island. In 1741, Joh Hart married Deborah Scudder. And she died in 1776. Right there when the Revolutionary War was beginning, he lost his wife. They had 13 children, as I mentioned. That was the most of any of the signers of the Declaration. So there's more of them than anybody else. John served in several local political posts, but he always maintained his farm. He also became a judge of the Common Pleas. Now, when they had the first Continental Congress, the Constitutional Congress, New Jersey was opposed to independence, and that was prior to June 1776. Joh Hart wasn't on the delegation that was sent to that. But then New Jersey decided that they were pro-revolution, and so they replaced the entire delegation, and Joh Hart was selected for the Second Continental Congress, and they were the ones that signed the Declaration of Independence. Now, in December of 1776, before a very famous battle that hopefully they still tell you about when you're in school, the British advanced into Hunterdon County, which is where the Harts lived. Joh Hart escaped to Amwell Township, which isn't that far from there. And he hid for a short time in a cave in the Sourland Mountains. Now, you can still go and visit that cave. I flipped my page here. Some of these speeches, I have to have some notes because I don't want to just wing the speech or try to memorize all this stuff because I'm an old man with a bad memory. Now, his farm was raided by the British and the Hessian troops, and the Hessians were these mercenary troops that the British hired from Germany, and they damaged the farm, but they didn't destroy the property. Now the Continental Army, after the famous crossing of the Delaware by George Washington and the attack on the Hessian outpost outside of Trenton on, I think it was Christmas. Not Christmas. Well, by the time they got there, it was Christmas. They probably left on Christmas Eve. Because they captured Trenton, it freed the whole area, and your ancestor was allowed to come back to where he lived. He wasn't afraid of being captured and killed. So then there was another battle that was going to be coming up, the Battle of Monmouth. And prior to that, Joh Hart invited George Washington and the Continental Army to use his farm as an encampment. And Washington took him up on that. And him and Washington hung out at least a couple times, had dinner and things like that. But the bad thing that happened is it was so cold that the troops had to take down his fences and use them for firewood to stay warm. I mean, there were 12,000 men that were there. So he might have had a lot of fences, but that was a lot of bodies to warm. He died at the age of 65 from kidney stones on May 11th of 1779. Well, they think he was 65, but he might have been 71. He's buried at the Old Baptist Meeting House to which he had donated land. So at one point in time, the Baptists needed a place to meet. And even though he wasn't a Baptist, I don't know what religion he was. I think he was a Presbyterian. He gave him this land. He died penniless because of the war. He actually gave up everything but his life for the country that he loved. And his assets wound up being sold at sheriff's sale. I'm going to read his obituary to you. On Tuesday, the 11th instant, departed this life at his seat in Hopewell, Joh Hart, Esquire, the representative in General Assembly for the county of Hunterdon and late Speaker of that House. He had served in the Assembly for many years under the former government, by former government meaning the British government. Taken an early and active part in the present revolution and continued to the day he was seized with his last illness to discharge the duties of a faithful and upright patriot in the service of his country in general and the country he represented in particular. The universal approbation of his character and conduct among all ranks of people is the best testimony of his worth, and as it must make his death regretted and lamented, will ensure lasting respect to his memory. And that was from the New Jersey Gazette. Now there's some places that you can find what are supposed to be portraits of him, but there's a possibility that there were never any portraits of him that survived, that nobody really knows what he looked like. There's several streets named after him, which include Hart Boulevard in Flemington, New Jersey, where I used to work, Hart Avenue in Hopewell, Hart Lane in Ringo's, that's another place in Hunterdon County that's pretty cool. And I'm pretty sure there's one in Trenton too. I think I found one day when I was working in Trenton. So guys, you're descended from a man who was willing to give up everything for the cause of freedom. And that's something that you can be proud of. But I want to warn you, be ready to make sacrifices in your life, because freedom isn't free. Peace out.